Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for taking the time with our editorial board today. I'm John Diaz, the editorial page editor. Welcome to the San Francisco Chronicle.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you, in both the debates and town halls, you've talked a lot about how you want to unite the country and that you're positioned to do it. As we're seeing, the Democratic Party itself has some serious and growing ideological divisions. So, what is your strategy to unite the party and then after that, a very polarized nation?
Well, I think as many have said about me, when you look at my record working in the Senate, how I've campaigned, I've always been someone that's brought people with me. And I personally was not that happy with how that debate went down last night, just to be topical, in terms of some of the ugliness, because I think the policy debates are so important to have. I cannot stress how important they are to have. Otherwise, we're not going to come out of this with an agreement on which candidate should lead our party. But at the same time, I think we have to continually remind ourselves, as I said at the end, that what unites us is bigger than what divides us. And you look at what happened in 2016. I don't want to even go into the reasons. There's so many things that went on, including a foreign country invading our election. But we do know some voters stayed home, both people who were progressive, but then also a lot of people who felt left out. And then my proof point is this, with Speaker Pelosi's leadership, actually, in 2018, Democratic Party comes roaring back in House races in places like, Orange County, and in places, governor's races in Kentucky. And this is not just limited to 2018. So my argument is that you need someone that can do this. Proof points, I've been able to work with Senator Sanders and Senator Warren, and I, in the panoply of people not getting along during the course of this campaign, have managed to keep good relationships. Bernie and I are in leadership together, along with the leadership with Elizabeth. There's only about 8 of us with Senator Schumer in leadership, so we know each other well. And then I'm someone who has been able to forge alliances in the Senate and in the country with people of various political beliefs in our party. I think I've been asked to do 35 state conventions and dinner speeches before I started running for president. Why is that? Well, they thought I could do pretty well in Kansas, and they thought I could do pretty well in Wisconsin, and then they thought I could do Vermont. So I think it's just a tribute to someone that's able to bridge the various parts of our political party. The next thing I would say is bringing in independents and moderate Republicans, which is going to be so important to building a coalition, to not just eking by a victory against Donald Trump at 4 a.m, but by winning big. That's what we need to do to keep that House strong as it is, and that's what we need to do to take back the U.S. Senate and win in states like Colorado, where I'm going to be tonight, or in Arizona.
If I could ask just a quick follow up, it was indeed a very spirited debate last night. But give us an example of what you found objectionable. You mentioned the ugliness. Give us an example, please.
I don't. Candidates are candidates. You have a new guy on the stage, and so people are going to say, "Welcome." We so much want you to come back. No, so I think that the what I didn't like was just the way the candidates did it. The questions, everything was really focused on everyone's research on this, as opposed to what people's views are and the ability to have in your answer how you're going to be able to take on Trump, or what is the policy difference with Trump. I get it, it's a primary, I'm not naive, but I think that that is part of what we've got to be able to do all the time. So people are just starting to tune in that haven't been watching these things, that aren't part of the obsessive group that watched all 10 debates. And we've really got to think about that and how we present our ticket and present our party. I'll give you one example: immigration reform. Fine to ask about some, an amendment I voted on 8 years ago. But in my case, what I really wanted to do was make the case that Senator Sanders had not voted for the 2007 immigration bill. Why did I think that was important for people to know? That is a big ticket item. That was one of those things where we worked with President Bush. We got a compromise bill. And that was what Vice President Biden and I both hit on at the end there. Those are big ticket items. When you look at how we're going to get a path to citizenship for people, it's going to require compromises, but it's really important.
Wanted to ask, do you support the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which would allow news organizations to compete collectively with online platforms such as Google and Facebook, which those duopolies have had a negative effect on journalism?
Do you know I'm the lead Democrat on the bill? I am. So I'm actually the lead Democrat on the bill, and worked with Senator Kennedy on that bill and helped draft it actually on our side. And then I think Cicilline has it over in the House. So I'm the ranking Democrat on the antitrust subcommittee. I wish I had the gavel. Over the last few years, we would have had a lot more hearings on consumer issues on issues like this. I would have actually, I do this committee with Senator Lee, but I would have I lived and breathed newspapers growing up, but it's also because I think that it is one of the remaining ways where people are able to access news that is real, that isn't fake, and it brings people together, as does local news, depending on the quality of that news, local TV, local radio, and it's a leavening force in a society that's become increasingly siloed and divided. I think it's critical to our democracy, not only the work of newspapers in doing investigations of local issues. If you take away local newspapers, as good as the some of the bigger newspapers may be, they're not going to be able to figure out something that's going on in a suburb of San Francisco, or what's happening with a local council race. All of that will be lost on the citizens if we do not have local newspapers. So I think the social media piece of this, where they've been able to basically access free content, as we know, but also allowing newspapers to have an antitrust exemption, which is what that bill does, to be able to consolidate is going to be very important. I'm actually writing a book on antitrust, a really weird fact about me, a very big book, going through the history and Teddy Roosevelt and the like, and the implications on the world that we live in right now. And there are the history is littered with various exemptions to the antitrust laws, some good, some bad, and including, of course, the baseball one, which is had some California implications I'm not going to get into, but that was a judicial opinion. In this case, there's many legislative exemptions to the antitrust laws, and so I thought long and hard before agreeing to lead this bill, and it made sense to me. I'd also add another thing I worked on for newspapers. I was one of the early co-sponsors of doing something about the tariff issue on the paper. When you remember this, the paper costs were skyrocketing up because of some moves from the Trump administration on tariffs. And I was one of the early advocates for changing that, and kind of went out on a limb on that as well.
You said last night that this prosecution of a 16-year-old that your office handled back when you were county attorney should be reviewed. You've taken some fair amount of credit for that prosecution over the years. To what extent do you deserve the blame for some of the potential excesses and mistakes in that prosecution that are now coming out?
Sure. Let me start back a bit, and that is that I think any prosecutor's goal must be to convict the guilty and protect the innocent. And that has been a major part of my work, both in the Senate, actually, and when I was county attorney. And it's worth a call to Barry Scheck or someone if you want to find out about the work I did back then. I was a pioneer of doing eyewitness identification in a different way. I debated the Queens DA as a young county attorney. I went to New York about videotaped interrogations because we had them in Minnesota, and I was a big advocate for that. I reviewed all of our cases that had DNA, our serious cases. This case did not involve DNA, and as you know, a lot of cases don't involve DNA, including murder cases. So this case, I supervise the office 10 to 15,000 cases a year. So I am responsible for what happened in the office in that way. I think my biggest part of my involvement here was that I got to know the family because this was such a horrific crime. An 11-year-old African-American girl was killed in an inner city neighborhood doing her homework at the kitchen table. And our job was to take the police investigation and take those cases and bring them forward. There were 3 convictions in the case. There wasn't just one involving the murder. And so this involves one of the people. The complexity of this involves the case that when I oversaw the office, I didn't do the trial myself. When I oversaw the office, that case involving Maya and Burrell was actually overturned because of a police and Miranda investigation issue and a few other things. So then it was retried after I was in the US Senate. So he's actually being held on a conviction, just so you know the facts, of the current occupant of the office. And so that's one interesting twist on this. So he was tried twice and convicted. So now the AP looked at this, and as I've said with any case, if there's new evidence, they have to look at it immediately. He has a good lawyer at a good law firm, and I would think that they are preparing a case to bring to the county attorney's office, and so that the evidence can be reviewed. But I do want you to see it as part of the bigger story that I was a longtime advocate for criminal justice reforms and have been in the Senate as a co-sponsor of the First Step Act, and would be in a unique position as the president to be able to make additional reforms. And it's everything from a clemency review board to review pardon requests, kind of in the news this week, and to make sure that is fair, and that it is not just the Justice Department or the president's own thought process that decides who gets pardons, and that also that we would get the Second Step Act, which would create incentives for the 90% of those incarcerated in state and local prisons to be able to get similar treatment, so you could get create incentives for reviews of sentences. One other thing is I've always been opposed to the death penalty, including during my time as a prosecutor. And my husband's actually nationally known expert on the death penalty. It's a little known fact that he actually wrote the preface to the book when Brookings published Stephen Breyer's dissent in the death penalty case.
My question is this: Sanders and Trump are very much disruptors, and on the other hand.
Yes.
On the other hand, you are the Midwest nice candidate. Doesn't that put you out of step with the public that wants vigorous, sharp-edged answers?
I actually think it puts me right in step. And I think people have seen over time, there were so many good candidates in this race, including my friend and your Senator Kamala Harris. And I actually do wish she was still in this race, as well as Corey and several others. But we are where we are. And I believe one of the reasons that I am still standing in this race is because I have been, one, very consistent in my views, whatever lane you want to call it, with where I stand on things like healthcare and as well as college and the like, and K through 12. I've had a major infrastructure focus, which I think is helpful. And I think my record, and this is what gets to your question, my record of actually getting things done and passing over 100 bills as the lead Democrat, step by step by step, that is very important to people. They want to know you have someone that actually can govern. That was a dispute I had with Elizabeth. To me, that was a joke that I would want to see Mitch McConnell remain as majority leader when he has over 400 bills sitting on his desk right now that have passed through the House of Representatives under Speaker Pelosi's leadership, including gun safety and democracy reforms and the like. But the truth is, as I said, you still can have someone that looks for common ground. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to to get things done. And I think the coarse rhetoric of Donald Trump is something that cannot remain. We need a president that when you turn on the TV, you don't have to mute the volume when your kids come in the room because you're afraid of what he or she is saying, or someone that doesn't send those mean tweets every single morning. It is going to be devastating for the rule of law to have a president that thinks he's above it for another 4 years. He's bulldozes through our democracy. He thinks he can decide who lives the American dream. All of those things lead me to think that the public is looking for something different. I don't think they're looking for someone richer. I don't think they're looking for someone louder. I do think they're looking for someone who can govern and someone who can debate him, and someone who is skilled enough and tough enough to be able to take him on. And I have proven I can do that. And it's one of the reasons I'm still standing in this race.
I would like to ask you, in regards, you brought up immigration earlier, and in light of recent immigration issues, I would like if you could explain how you'd overhaul the immigration and customs enforcement while also ending family separation.
So second question of the family separation, you can actually do that yourself as president. And I have put together 137 things that a president can do herself without Congress that are legal. This is similar to what FDR did in his first 100 days. And I think it is really important for public trust to do that. And one of the things you can do is change that policy immediately. Obviously, the real answer here is comprehensive immigration reform. And I think making the economic case, which you can make so strongly in San Francisco, that immigrants don't diminish America, they are America. 70 of our Fortune 500 companies headed up by people from other countries, 25% of our US Nobel laureates born in other countries. Needing workers in our factories, in our fields, and starting small businesses. Leading to, why do I lead with that instead of going right to your question? Not to avoid it, but because I think anything we talk about with immigration, you really have to lead with the strength in order to bring the public with us. In terms of reform of some of these policies, I would end the private detention centers, and that's something a president can actually do. I visited the one in Homestead. They won't even let you in, but you could stand on a ladder. This is outside of Miami, and see the stark conditions there. I would reform ICE. I wouldn't get rid of it, but I would reform it by taking some of the obligations and some of their, I would call mission, I suppose, and put it under better oversight, of course, better oversight from Congress, but also in Homeland Security. I think that there's been abuse of these policies. One example, people have served in the military. There is a policy in place that before they're deported, that they're supposed to be checking with higher ups, and that wasn't happening, as you know, and you were actually having people who had served being deported. And I just think there are things that they are doing right now. Their mission is too broad, and it has to be brought back, and some of those functions have to be put in everything from the Justice Department to Homeland Security. And then, of course, they need better leadership. And the problem, of course, with Donald Trump in, it is very hard to get career people who want to implement his policies. A few have tried, and I think they've been quietly trying to resist some of them. They either get fired or they leave, and it's a major, major problem. And so we have to get through this next year, but it's another reason why we need a new president immediately. But I just having worked on, and I expressed this last night with deep passion, I don't have as big an immigrant community as California. I have the biggest Somali population, biggest Liberian population in the country, second biggest Hmong to California, growing Hispanic population. And yet I have stood up for immigrants from the beginning. I had multiple ads run against me in my 2006 Senate race because I was strongly for a path to citizenship. I then, because of that, Senator Kennedy asked me to work in the small group on immigration reform when Bush was president. We got an agreement on that bill, and sadly, the right-wing talk radio and Lou Dobbs and the like pushed back, and it failed. Then Obama tried, both presidents tried for two different reasons, late in their terms or in Obama's second term. And in his case, we passed it in the Senate with bipartisan support. Senator Feinstein worked on it, of course, in great detail. And then it ended up and landing in John Boehner's freezer next to the frozen peas and went nowhere. Well, now Nancy Pelosi is Speaker. And so if you have a president that makes this a big priority in the first year and is committed to doing it in year one, and actually has some, it's from the Midwest where it's been harder to get votes on things like immigration reform and, by the way, climate change, I actually think that is a positive for getting it done, as well as someone who has the experience to get things done and know where the bodies are. I was in that group. Last thing I'll say, the most recent immigration dispute, Tim Kaine and I were probably two of the more progressive people in the room, with a group that included Flake, when he was still there, Mike Rounds headed it up to try to get agreement on the Dreamers. We got a pretty good agreement, and that agreement would have allowed the Dreamers a path to citizenship and taken care of the temporary status people. Republicans agreed to it, got punched by the administration, which was to me just a shock. But I know where the bodies are buried when it comes to immigration in the Senate. Chamber of Commerce, strong support. Farm Bureau, strong support. AFL-CIO, migrant groups. We can put this deal together again.
So now all the Democratic candidates, yourself included just a few minutes ago, say that they are the ones who can stand toe-to-toe with President Trump, a bully who's also the leader of the free world. But the debate last night, you seem to be unnerved by a guy who's been nothing more than the mayor of a small town. I mean, how can voters, and who in your words, does not a little more than memorize some talking points, how can voters trust that you can take on President Trump when Mayor Pete got under your skin last night?
I wasn't unnerved. I was mad. I just thought it was important to explain that I don't think that we should have someone heading up our ticket who has not been able to win a statewide office and lost by over 20 points, despite the merits of the strength of his candidacy, and also lost a race for the Democratic National Committee chair. I think the stakes are too high. And I've said that repeatedly through this campaign. And in this case, I actually was simply trying to answer questions, and he was focused on some attacks on me. That's fine, that happens. I think I have a bit of a target on my back, if you didn't notice, because of the fact that I've been surging since New Hampshire. Not just in New Hampshire. I was ahead of him in one national poll, the Quinnipiac poll, just this last week, and in double digits in Nevada poll, and got the Las Vegas Sun endorsement along with the vice president. So it didn't surprise me that it happened, but I think having some passion about responding when I feel so strongly about immigration reform, and he was hitting me on things that I didn't think were fair, yeah, I'm going to respond. You pick different responses in different ways. I think you saw me during the Kavanaugh hearing. That was a pretty intense situation, and understand that I show grace under pressure all the time. But I felt it was important when he was going after me on what I thought was a minor thing for which I had apologized, and he just kept at it. If you want to make that the centerpiece, he can. But I think the most important thing here is to know that he wasn't really getting under my skin. I just felt like I had to make my case. And that was a wild and woolly debate. And I hope the next one will be more substantive for everybody, but mostly for our party and our country, because tons of people are watching those debates. And I suppose it's possible I was frustrated with the whole scene at the debate, because I know more than anyone, as the only one up there that's consistently won in a purple state and brought in suburban and rural voters, that they're starting to watch right now. Moderate Republicans, independents, and I want our party to offer something better than Donald Trump. I want our party to give them a reason to either not stay home or to vote for one of us. And I just don't think that happened last night, because I wanted to make this strong case, as I tried to do on, yeah, we can do climate change, but still make sure that people are whole. with dividends and the like. We can do legislation on climate change. We do not have to give free college for all to do bold things when it comes to education. We do not have to kick 149 million people off their current health insurance in 4 years to make major movements on healthcare. I'm the leader on the pharmaceutical issues in the Senate. I lead a number of the bills, and I know that it's ripe to take on those prices, and our president hasn't done them. I just think there's a lot of big policy issues for people that weren't covered last night in the zest to cut up more of the pie and to take pieces of the pie away from other candidates. And I just hadn't come into the debate with that intention.
If I could get in one final question. We are here in San Francisco, where the homelessness crisis is pervasive and seemingly intractable. A lot of folks who are involved in working with homelessness here think that the federal disinvestment in housing is at least a factor. What do you see as the federal role in addressing the homeless crisis?
Sure. I think it's a major role. And first, let me say I've actually spent a lot of time in your city and a lot of time walking around. I remember seeing the murals of the people that used to live in certain areas that people had painted that had been displaced because of housing issues. My best friend from law school, Kate Stacy, heads up land use for the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. And so I've actually, just from a friendship, been pretty schooled in what's going on in the city with homelessness. And this is how I look at it. First of all, to get this done in a big way, we're going to have a coalition, and it's focused on urban homeless issues like you have in your city, but you know they have them in spades in other towns as well. But also making that connection with rural, because there are housing deserts in rural. There are towns that want to bring in medium-sized businesses but can't because they have no housing or their old housing stock hasn't been rehabbed. So I always look at these things practically first to build the coalition. My housing plan is actually one of the broadest. It was unveiled in California when we had the debate in LA at a housing project. With the mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter, St. Paul, Minnesota, who's a young, progressive African-American mayor. He worked on the policy with me. And I think of key value to San Francisco. The first thing it does is tackle the Section 8 backlog in a big, big way to get the waiting time down to 2 to 3 months. I'm sure you've heard this, there's years of people waiting for housing without temporary housing. Secondly, creating incentives for building more housing, both in urban and in rural. And then third, of course, helping people to pay for housing. Everything I do, I show how I'm going to pay for it. I can send you our list because I've hated the way this president has treated people like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos and keeps adding debt every day. How I would pay for this is by doing a minimum corporate tax of 15%, which would bring in a whole lot of money. Because there's so many corporations that aren't paying any taxes, and then a number of other pay-fors that are related to the tax bill and other things. So I can send you all of that.
Very good. Senator Amy Klobuchar, on behalf of the San Francisco Chronicle, really want to thank you for taking this time with our editorial board.
That's it? Are you kidding?